Hey guys, tonight we're taking a peek behind the gilded curtains of ancient revelry, pulling back the festive mask to expose something truly unsettling. You might imagine grand feasts, joyous dances, and endless merriment when you think of ancient celebrations, picturing something like a Roman toga party from the movies or a fantastical Renaissance fair. But tonight, we're going to explore why ancient celebrations were actually terrible and more. Forget your worries about awkward family gatherings or forgetting someone's birthday. These were events fraught with real danger, discomfort, and often sheer misery. You probably think a crowded concert is a nightmare, but you'd likely run screaming from a typical ancient festival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it for you? Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the awful side of ancient celebrations. Our journey begins, as all good and terrible feasts do, with the food and drink. But forget your modern, climate-controlled supermarkets and refrigerated trucks delivering fresh produce from across the nation. In ancient times, and particularly during large public celebrations, food and drink scarcity and sickness was a terrifying reality. Imagine a huge festival in, say, ancient Rome, or even a large gathering in a burgeoning colonial American settlement before modern agricultural techniques. Thousands of people descend upon a city or a central gathering point. How do you feed them all, and how do you do it safely? The answer, often, was poorly. Food preservation was rudimentary. Think of salted meats that were still on the edge of rancidity, or dried grains that had been stored for months, perhaps infested with pests. Fresh produce was seasonal and local, meaning that if a harvest was bad or if the supply lines were disrupted by even a minor storm, scarcity was immediate. You might complain about organic options at your local Whole Foods, but these people would have been thrilled to just have anything edible, even if it came with a side of dysentery. During large celebrations, the demand for food would skyrocket, stretching already fragile supply chains to their breaking point. What was available was often of lower quality, or prepared under conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint. Imagine enormous vats of stew, cooked over open fires for hours, exposed to dust, flies, and the constant touch of unwashed hands. Meats might not be cooked thoroughly, or they might come from animals that were already sick. Water, too, was a constant challenge. Fresh. Clean water was a luxury, and during massive gatherings, sources could quickly become contaminated, turning a refreshing drink into a death sentence. The result? Widespread food poisoning and waterborne diseases. A grand feast could quickly turn into a mass casualty event. Diarrhea, vomiting, and high fevers would sweep through the celebrants, quickly incapacitating hundreds, if not thousands. The misery wasn't just the physical agony of sickness. It was the psychological terror of knowing that the very sustenance meant to bring joy and sustenance was instead delivering agonizing illness. Imagine trying to enjoy a party when half the attendees are violently ill, and you're just praying you're not next. And the drink. While alcohol was often safer than water as the fermentation process killed some pathogens, it was far from refined. Ancient wines were often diluted with questionable water, or sometimes even flavored with lead unknowingly, of course, which could cause chronic poisoning. Beers were murky and often low in alcohol content, but could still transmit disease if the water source was contaminated. The widespread consumption of alcohol also led to other problems, which we'll delve into later. But for now, just picture the unsanitary conditions of communal drinking vessels, passed from mouth to mouth, spreading whatever ills were circulating. You might politely decline a drink from a shared punch bowl, but back then, you were probably risking a lot more than just a cold. A common historical fact: grain supplies were absolutely critical for ancient civilizations, and their stability directly impacted public festivities. In ancient Rome, for instance, The distribution of cheap or free grain, the cura annani, was essential for maintaining social order, particularly during festivals which were often tied to agricultural cycles. A disruption in grain supply, due to bad harvests or military campaigns, could immediately turn a planned celebration into a riot, with the populace facing starvation instead of revelry. This highlights how precarious the food situation always was, and how easily a festive atmosphere could sour into widespread misery due to basic resource scarcity. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about ancient celebratory food involves the use of garum, a fermented fish sauce popular in Roman cuisine, often served with nearly everything. Imagine a large vat of fish guts and small fish left to ferment under the scorching Mediterranean sun for weeks or months. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, and the hygiene standards for its production were, shall we say, non-existent. While it provided a rich, savory flavor, it was also a breeding ground for bacteria if not prepared carefully. And consuming large quantities of such a potent, unhygienic condiment during a public feast would have been a significant risk for immediate gastrointestinal distress. You might enjoy a gourmet meal with fine sauces, but garum probably smelled like a dumpster on a hot summer day. The psychological impact of such precarious food and drink was immense. It meant that even moments of supposed joy and communal bonding were tinged with a constant, low-level anxiety. Every bite, every sip, carried the potential for severe illness or death. This uncertainty fostered a kind of fatalism, a feeling that life was always on the edge of disaster, even during its most celebrated moments. The misery wasn't just in the physical pain of sickness, but in the constant dread of it, and the helplessness against an invisible enemy transmitted through the very sustenance meant to nourish. The physical environment of these celebrations added another layer of misery. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Leftover scraps would attract vermin, rats, mice, and insects, which in turn carried diseases. The sheer volume of organic waste generated by thousands of people feasting would have quickly overwhelmed any primitive waste disposal systems, leading to putrid smells and unhygienic conditions that further contributed to the spread of illness. Imagine a festival ground after a few days of revelry, not a pleasant park, but a teeming, smelly, disease-ridden wasteland. The academic debate about the quality of ancient diets and public health often grapples with how much the awfulness was a perceived reality versus an actual one. Some historians argue that while hygiene was poor by modern standards, ancient communities developed robust, albeit rudimentary, methods for food preservation like salting and drying, and understood the dangers of stagnant water, suggesting that large-scale food poisoning, while certainly happening, might not have been a constant, overwhelming threat at every large celebration. They contend that people had a practical, if unscientific, understanding of basic food safety. The misery, in this view, was real, but perhaps not omnipresent. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the sheer volume of archaeological and textual evidence pointing to pervasive levels of parasitic infections, bacterial diseases, and chronic malnutrition, even in relatively prosperous ancient societies. Arguing that ancient celebrations, with their inevitable lapses in hygiene, would have been highly effective vectors for widespread illness, making food and drink a constant source of potential misery. They suggest that modern sensibilities simply cannot grasp the baseline level of unhealthiness in ancient life. It's a debate that makes you ponder the fine line between adaptation to harsh conditions and the inevitable consequences of fundamental scientific ignorance, as the lukewarm, possibly tainted, ancient beverages and the questionable feast provisions from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebratory food and drink were actually terrible. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and danger to ancient revelers. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of sickness and discomfort. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, hygienic safety of your own refrigerator and readily available clean drinking water. A reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful sight of ancient feasts. As the lingering taste of questionable ancient feasts and the unsettling specter of foodborne illness from our last chapter mercifully fade, you now find yourself amidst an even more pervasive source of misery in ancient celebrations, crowds and disease a breeding ground. Forget the controlled environment of a modern stadium or concert hall. Ancient large gatherings were often unsanitary, chaotic cauldrons where human proximity transformed into a terrifying vector for sickness. Imagine yourself in the heart of ancient Athens during the Dionysia, a grand festival honoring Dionysus, the god of wine and theater. Thousands of citizens and visitors from surrounding regions pour into the city. The narrow streets, already bustling on a normal day, become choked with throngs of people. You are shoulder to shoulder, pressed tightly against strangers, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, and perhaps the faint aroma of sacrificial smoke. You might complain about long lines at Disney World, but at least those lines are usually in the fresh air, and everyone's had a shower recently. Here, you're navigating a human tide, a slow-moving, intensely pungent wave of humanity. This sheer density of people, a common feature of any major ancient celebration, was a perfect incubator for disease. Without knowledge of germ theory, people had no understanding that a simple cough, a sneeze, or even a casual touch could transmit deadly pathogens. One person carrying a common cold, or worse, something like influenza or measles, could become the unwitting superspreader for an entire city. Imagine the sheer volume of expelled breath, the unwashed hands touching everything, the droplets suspended in the stagnant air of tightly packed spaces. The primitive sanitation systems of the ancient world exacerbated the problem. Public latrines, if they existed, were often overflowing and unsanitary. Personal hygiene was rudimentary at best. Bathing was infrequent for many, and hand-washing, as we know it, was not a common practice. When thousands gathered, human waste would accumulate rapidly, both on the streets and in designated areas, attracting flies and other vermin that could then carry disease from one person to the next, or from waste to food. You might worry about a public restroom, but at least modern ones usually flush. Consider the Athenian plague of 430 BCE, a devastating epidemic that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War, precisely when large numbers of people had crowded into the city walls for safety. Thucydides, the historian, described the horrific symptoms: fever, vomiting, agonizing thirst, skin lesions, and internal burning. The sheer concentration of people within the city, a direct result of wartime refuge, turned Athens into a death trap. The disease spread like wildfire, killing an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of the population, including Pericles, the city's leading statesman. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a horrifying demonstration of how easily disease could decimate a population packed into unsanitary conditions. The misery wasn't just about getting sick, it was the psychological terror of mass contagion. Imagine witnessing scores of people falling ill around you, knowing that any interaction, any breath, any shared space could be your last. The fear would be palpable, a suffocating blanket over the supposed joy of the festival. Families would be torn apart as loved ones succumbed, and the constant presence of illness and death would strip away any pretense of celebration, a common historical fact. The lack of effective quarantine measures in ancient times meant that diseases could spread unchecked during festivals. While some ancient societies did attempt isolation, the understanding of how diseases transmitted was so poor that efforts were often too little, too late, and easily circumvented. People might try to avoid the sick, but without knowing the actual vectors of transmission like airborne droplets or contaminated surfaces, their efforts were largely futile, making any large gathering a high-risk event. It's like trying to stop a wildfire with a teacup. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about these crowded ancient celebrations is the phenomenon of festival collapse or stampedes. While often less documented than plagues, the sheer density of unregulated crowds, combined with alcohol consumption, excitement, or panic, could lead to deadly crushes. Imagine being caught in a human wave, unable to move, unable to breathe, as thousands of bodies press in on you. The ancient Roman spectacles, with their immense crowds and often violent entertainment, were particularly susceptible to such dangers. While not directly a disease, mass suffocation in a crowd was a very real, terrifying risk for ancient revelers. Turning a celebration into a mass burial? It's not just a bad mood, it's literally being crushed to death by your fellow partygoers. The psychological impact of living in a world where crowds were synonymous with contagion was profound. It meant that public gatherings, intended for communal bonding and religious devotion, were also deeply unsettling. There was a constant underlying tension, the desire to participate, to celebrate, versus the very real fear of becoming another casualty of the invisible killer lurking in the masses. This constant vigilance, this awareness of vulnerability, eroded the pure joy of the occasion, replacing it with a grim calculation of risk versus reward. This fear also influenced social behavior. While people couldn't avoid all crowds, they might limit their participation or engage in superstitious rituals to ward off disease. The poor, who often lived in more crowded and unsanitary conditions, were disproportionately affected, reinforcing existing social inequalities and adding another layer of misery to their already difficult lives. The communal joy of celebration was often overshadowed by the stark reality of their own fragility. The academic debate about the precise mortality rates of ancient plagues and the role of crowd density often centers on the reliability of ancient sources and the difficulty of retroactively diagnosing diseases. Some historians argue that ancient accounts, while dramatic, might sometimes exaggerate the impact of plagues or conflate various illnesses, suggesting that while outbreaks were severe, their overall long-term demographic impact might be debated in certain instances. They contend that ancient societies, despite their lack of medical knowledge, developed some communal immunities over time. The misery, in this view, was episodic rather than constant. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the archaeological and genetic evidence that points to widespread, chronic disease burdens in ancient populations, arguing that even seemingly minor gatherings would have served as significant vectors for infection, and that major festivals would have been consistently devastating events from a public health perspective, making the misery widespread and frequent. They suggest that modern medical understanding allows us to fully appreciate the horrific scale of ancient contagion. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense challenges of reconstructing the biological realities of the past and the horrifying invisible enemies that constantly preyed on ancient communities. As the suffocating press of ancient crowds and the terrifying specter of unseen pathogens from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations were often terrifying breeding grounds for disease. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and widespread death to ancient revelers. Their enjoyment, however brief, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of falling ill in a world without effective medicine. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible safeguards of modern public health, the clean water, the vaccination programs, and the understanding of contagion or reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient crowds. As the suffocating press of ancient crowds and the terrifying specter of unseen pathogens from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, leaving you in the comforting quiet of your space, we now pivot to an even sharper, more visceral fear that often permeated ancient celebrations: violence and unrest. A dark undercurrent? Forget your polite holiday parties or controlled public events in the ancient world. Large gatherings were often volatile cauldrons, where merriment could swiftly descend into brutal chaos, crime, and the raw savagery of human conflict. Imagine yourself in the bustling marketplace of a major ancient city, perhaps Rome during a public holiday. or a frontier town in America during a raucous 4th of July celebration in the early 19th century. The air is thick with sounds, shouts of vendors, the murmur of hundreds of conversations, the music of flutes and lyres. But beneath this festive veneer, attention crackles. Alcohol flows freely, tempers are short, and the anonymity of the crowd emboldens those who seek trouble. You might worry about a rude person cutting in line at the grocery store, but here, a minor insult could escalate into a brawl. Or worse, a riot. Violence was an ever-present threat. Without modern policing, public order was tenuous. Any large gathering, especially those fueled by alcohol and heightened emotions, was ripe for disputes turning bloody. Imagine watching two men argue over a spilled drink, only for the argument to erupt into a violent fistfight, then a knife appearing, and suddenly, blood is staining the festive ground. The absence of effective law enforcement meant that such incidents could quickly spiral, with onlookers either joining the fray or scattering in terror. You'd probably call 911 if you saw something like that. But in ancient times, you were largely on your own, beyond individual brawls. Ancient celebrations were often fertile ground for mass unrest and riots. Economic grievances, political frustrations, or ethnic tensions that simmered under the surface of daily life could explode during these large, uncontrolled gatherings. Imagine a festival meant to celebrate victory, suddenly transforming into a furious mob, tearing down statues, looting shops, or clashing with authorities. The sheer power of a collective, unbridled human surge, driven by anger or despair, was a terrifying force. Buildings could be set ablaze, lives lost indiscriminately, and entire neighborhoods devastated, all stemming from the volatile energy of a celebration gone terribly wrong. A common historical fact: gladiatorial games and public executions were often integrated into ancient Roman festivals and celebrations, particularly those sponsored by emperors or wealthy citizens. These events, far from being just sideshows, were central to the festivities and deliberately designed to provide brutal entertainment and demonstrate power. While providing a form of controlled violence, they also accustomed the populace to bloodshed and likely lowered inhibitions, contributing to a more generally violent atmosphere during celebrations. Imagine attending a joyous festival, then watching people literally tear each other apart for entertainment, then heading back to the streets where real fights might break out. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about violence during ancient celebrations involves the phenomenon of mob justice, or summary executions. In the absence of formal legal structures or during periods of heightened collective emotion, crowds at festivals could turn on individuals accused rightly or wrongly of crimes, sacrilege, or simply being outsiders. Imagine a pickpocket caught in the act, or a person accused of blasphemy against the festival's deity. Instead of facing a trial, they could be brutally beaten, stoned, or lynched by the enraged crowd, their screams swallowed by the festive din. This terrifying spontaneous justice highlights the sheer savagery that lurked beneath the surface of ancient celebrations, transforming joyous gatherings into terrifying free-for-alls where individual lives held little value. You might hear about a controversial figure online, but here they'd be lucky to make it out alive from a mob. The presence of soldiers or guards did little to alleviate this pervasive threat of violence. Often, they were outnumbered, poorly disciplined, or even contributed to the chaos themselves. Their interventions could be brutal, leading to further bloodshed and escalating, rather than quelling the unrest. Imagine seeing armed guards wading into a crowd, clubs swinging, swords drawn, causing more panic and injury than they prevented. The peace they maintained was often bought at a terrible price. Beyond outright physical violence, there was the pervasive threat of petty crime and exploitation. Thieves thrived in crowded environments, pickpocketing and snatching goods from unsuspecting revelers. Prostitution and illicit gambling often flourished on the fringes of these events, leading to further social problems and exploitation, particularly of the vulnerable. You might worry about losing your wallet in a busy place, but here it was a daily occurrence and often without any hope of recourse. The psychological impact of such pervasive violence and unrest was immense. It meant that even moments of supposed joy and communal bonding were tinged with a constant, high-level anxiety. Every street corner, every dense crowd, carried the potential for sudden, brutal conflict. This constant vigilance fostered a sense of insecurity, a feeling that your safety was always precarious, dependent on the whims of a volatile crowd or the fleeting attention of corrupt guards. The misery wasn't just in witnessing or experiencing violence, but in the constant dread of it, in the knowledge that any celebration could turn into a life or death struggle. This fear also influenced social interactions. People might stick to tightly knit groups, avoid certain areas, or remain constantly on guard, unable to truly relax and enjoy the festivities. For the marginalized and vulnerable foreigners, the poor, women, or those without strong social connections, the dangers were even greater, as they were often the first targets of aggression or exploitation. The communal joy of celebration was often overshadowed by the stark reality of their own vulnerability. The academic debate about the true extent of violence in ancient daily life versus during festivals often grapples with the sensationalism of historical accounts. Some historians argue that while violence was certainly present in ancient societies, accounts of widespread chaos during celebrations might sometimes be exaggerated by moralizing authors or those seeking to highlight societal decay, suggesting that many festivities were generally orderly and served important social functions without constant bloodshed. They contend that human nature, even in ancient times, sought pleasure and order. The misery, in this view, was real but perhaps localized and episodic. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the lack of formal policing, the widespread acceptance of certain forms of violence like public floggings or gladiatorial combat, and the documented instances of riots and civil unrest, arguing that ancient celebrations, with their potent mix of alcohol, large crowds, and social tensions, would have been inherently more violent and dangerous than any modern equivalent, making the misery a pervasive reality. They suggest that modern sensibilities cannot truly grasp the baseline level of physical danger in ancient life. It's a debate that makes you ponder the fundamental differences in social order and human behavior across millennia, and the brutal reality of living in a world without effective rule of law, as the shouts of ancient mobs and the glint of unseen blades from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations were often terrifying cauldrons of violence and unrest. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and danger to ancient revelers. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of sudden conflict, a danger far more immediate than a long line or a bad meal. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, pervasive presence of modern public safety, the organized events, the emergency services, and the general expectation of order. A reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities. As the chaotic echoes of ancient riots and the chilling glint of unseen blades from our last chapter mercifully fade, and the quiet hum of your room once again offers solace, we now delve into an insidious threat that often accompanied ancient celebrations: disease and public health. Forget your modern hospitals, sanitation departments, and widespread vaccinations in the ancient world. During large gatherings, the very air seemed to thicken with unseen dangers, transforming joyous occasions into potential death traps. Imagine yourself in a vibrant, bustling, ancient city like Alexandria, Egypt, during a grand religious festival. The air is warm and humid, carrying the scent of exotic spices, burning incense, and unwashed crowds. You see thousands of people gathered, merchants from distant lands, pilgrims seeking blessings, performers entertaining the masses. But what you don't see, what no one understood, were the teeming colonies of bacteria and viruses thriving in the unsanitary conditions, waiting for their moment to strike. You might feel a little grossed out by a dirty subway car, but at least your city has a sewage system that isn't just a ditch. The fundamental issue was a profound lack of understanding about germ theory. People simply didn't know that microscopic organisms cause disease. Instead, as we briefly touched on in Chapter 2, they attributed illness to miasma, bad air, divine wrath, witchcraft, or an imbalance of humors within the body. This ignorance meant that all efforts to control disease during mass gatherings were woefully inadequate, and often counterproductive. Imagine trying to fight a ghost when the real enemy is an invisible army you don't even know exists. Public sanitation, a cornerstone of modern public health, was almost non-existent by our standards. Ancient cities, even the grandest ones, struggled immensely with waste management. Human and animal waste often accumulated in streets, open ditches, or flowed directly into waterways that also served as sources of drinking water. During festivals, the sheer volume of additional waste would overwhelm these already primitive systems. Picture thousands of people attending a festival for days, with limited access to latrines, leading to the rapid accumulation of excrement and refuse. This created fertile breeding grounds for flies, rats, and other vectors of disease like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. You probably take flushing toilets for granted. But in the ancient world, it was often a luxury reserved for the elite, if it existed at all. Water supply was another critical vulnerability. While some ancient cities had impressive aqueducts, distributing clean water to vast populations, especially during periods of increased demand like festivals, was a constant challenge. Contamination of water sources was frequent, particularly when upstream activities involved human or animal waste. Imagine dipping your cup into a seemingly fresh stream, unaware that just upstream, hundreds of people are relieving themselves, or that animal carcasses are rotting nearby. A celebratory drink could literally be a sip of death. Beyond the visible filth and contaminated water, the sheer proximity of individuals in crowded festival environments served as a powerful vector for airborne diseases. Respiratory illnesses like influenza, measles, and even tuberculosis, which were often endemic in ancient populations, would have spread with terrifying efficiency. One cough, one sneeze, one shared drinking cup could initiate a chain reaction of infection throughout the entire gathering. Imagine the constant feeling of vulnerability, knowing that every person you brushed past could be carrying a deadly illness. A common historical fact. The lack of personal hygiene contributed significantly to disease transmission during ancient celebrations. Regular bathing, as we practice it today, was not universal, and soap was either rudimentary or non-existent. Hand washing, especially after using latrines or handling food, was not understood as a critical preventative measure against germ spread. This baseline level of uncleanliness, combined with close proximity in crowds, meant that pathogens could easily transfer from person to person through direct contact or contaminated surfaces, turning any celebration into a super spreader event. It's like living in a constant public health emergency. Only no one knows what the emergency is. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about disease and ancient celebrations is the concept of ritual impurity and its unwitting role in spreading disease. Many ancient cultures had elaborate rituals and taboos around purity, often relating to death, childbirth, or certain bodily fluids. While these practices were spiritual, they sometimes had unintended public health consequences. For example, some rituals involved touching or being in close proximity to the sick or deceased, without understanding the biological dangers. Conversely, some practices that seemed to promote hygiene, like ritual cleansing, were often superficial and did not prevent the spread of unseen germs. Imagine participating in a solemn religious rite, believing you are purifying yourself, while unknowingly facilitating the spread of a deadly infection within your community. Simply due to the scientific ignorance of the time, it turns devotion into a dangerous gamble. The psychological impact of living with such pervasive health threats during celebrations was immense. The supposed joy of collective merriment was constantly overshadowed by a grim awareness of potential illness and death. When a sickness swept through a community after a festival, It fostered a deep sense of helplessness and fatalism. People watched as loved ones fell ill, often with agonizing symptoms, and could do nothing but pray, sacrifice, or resort to ineffective remedies. This created a pervasive anxiety that holidays and large gatherings, rather than bringing unadulterated happiness, were also moments of profound vulnerability and grief. This fear also dictated social behavior. While people couldn't avoid all celebrations, they might approach them with a sense of trepidation, aware of the risks involved. The sick and the vulnerable would often be excluded or avoid such gatherings, adding to their isolation and misery. For those who attended, the experience would be a mix of exhilaration and dread, a testament to the human spirit's desire for connection even in the face of overwhelming danger. The academic debate about the specific impact of ancient celebrations on public health often grapples with the interplay between chronic endemic diseases and acute epidemic outbreaks. Some historians argue that while ancient populations certainly suffered from high rates of disease, they also developed a certain level of natural immunity to common pathogens due to constant exposure from childhood, suggesting that not every large celebration would lead to a catastrophic plague, but rather a constant, low-level health burden. They contend that ancient peoples had adapted to their germ-filled environments. The misery, in this view, was constant, but major spikes were not guaranteed. Conversely, other scholars emphasize that even endemic diseases could be exacerbated by the sudden influx and concentration of people during festivals, arguing that these events would have almost invariably led to significant spikes in illness and mortality, particularly for the young, the old, and those new to the area. They suggest that the sheer density of a festival crowd, combined with poor sanitation, created an ideal environment for rapid and widespread disease transmission, making the misery an almost inevitable outcome. It's a debate that makes you ponder the relentless, invisible war humanity fought against pathogens in ancient times. A struggle made exponentially harder by collective ignorance, as the unseen legions of ancient germs and the haunting specter of public health crises from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations were often terrifying breeding grounds for disease. These weren't just unfortunate coincidences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and widespread death to ancient revelers. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of falling ill in a world without effective medicine. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, pervasive presence of modern public health, the clean water, the vaccination programs, and the understanding of contagion, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities, as the chilling, unseen threats of ancient plagues and the devastating realities of public health crises from our last chapter mercifully recede. Allowing the quiet hum of your room to reassert its calm, we now turn our attention to a far more insidious and deeply ingrained source of misery in ancient celebrations: ritual and sacrifice, blood and fear. Forget your modern, polite religious services or festive parades. In the ancient world, many celebrations were steeped in gruesome rituals, animal sacrifice, and even, in darker tales, human offerings, all designed to appease volatile gods or ensure cosmic harmony, but often leaving a chilling residue of fear and brutality. Imagine yourself in the heart of a grand temple precinct in ancient Rome during a major public festival, or perhaps observing a harvest ritual in a nascent colonial American community, still holding on to old-world superstitions. The air is thick, not just with incense and celebratory shouts, but with the distinct, metallic tang of blood. You watch as a priest, or a community elder, leads a pristine animal, a bull, a goat, a pig to a stone altar. The animal is calm, perhaps adorned with garlands, but its fate is sealed. You might feel a little squeamish watching a butcher shop documentary, but here you're witnessing the sacred, violent act firsthand. Right in the center of the festivities, animal sacrifice was a pervasive and central element of religious life and many celebrations in the ancient world. It wasn't just a sideshow, it was the main event. believed to be the essential act of communion between mortals and the divine. The theory was simple: by offering the gods something precious, something living, you appeased their wrath, gained their favor, or ensured the continuation of blessings like a good harvest or military victory. Imagine the economic strain this placed on communities, constantly needing to provide healthy, unblemished animals for ritual slaughter. The act itself was often brutal. While attempts were made to make the killing swift, it was still a public, messy display of violence. The animal's throat would be cut, its blood collected in bowls, parts of its entrails examined for omens, and specific portions burned on the altar for the gods, while the rest was butchered for the celebratory feast. The sounds, the lowing of the animal, the sharp cut, the sizzling of flesh, would have been a visceral part of the experience. This wasn't just a culinary event, it was a profound, chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the demands of the divine. You might find factory farming unpleasant, but at least you don't have to watch your dinner die as a religious act. The psychological impact on observers, particularly children, would have been profound. Growing up with regular exposure to public animal slaughter as a sacred act would have normalized violence to a degree that is difficult for us to comprehend today. It imbued celebrations with a grim undertone, a constant reminder that favor from the gods came at a price, often a bloody one, a common historical fact. In ancient Roman and Greek religious practices, the careful observation of animal entrails haruspicy after a sacrifice was a critical part of the ritual, believed to reveal the god's will or future events. The liver, in particular, was meticulously examined for abnormalities, color, and shape. This practice highlights that the sacrifice wasn't just about the offering, but about interpreting the bloody aftermath for divine messages, adding another layer of anxious anticipation to the already gruesome event. Imagine the pressure on the priest to read the future correctly, knowing that a misinterpretation could bring divine wrath upon the community. One particularly chilling, lesser-known detail about these rituals relates to the concept of scapegoating during certain ancient festivals. In some cultures, particularly during times of plague or great hardship, an animal, or sometimes even a human, though this is less common in the primary historical record of classical societies, would be ritually loaded with the sins and misfortunes of the community, then driven out or sacrificed to carry away the collective guilt and ill fortune. Imagine a goat, or even a person, being publicly reviled, beaten, and then sent into the wilderness or killed, literally bearing the weight of everyone's woes. This wasn't just a symbolic act, it was a desperate, terrifying attempt to cleanse a community of its perceived impurities, often at the expense of an innocent victim, turning a celebratory ritual into an act of profound social cruelty and fear. It makes you realize how easily fear could be externalized onto a vulnerable target, beyond animal sacrifice. Whispered tales and historical accounts from some cultures, though less common in ancient Athens or Rome themselves. Influences from surrounding empires and earlier eras would still be known tell of human sacrifice. While often demonized by later societies, archaeological evidence and textual accounts suggest that in some ancient cultures, particularly during times of extreme crisis or for the most important festivals, human life was offered to the gods. Imagine the ultimate terrorist celebration where the most precious offering was a human being, chosen or volunteered, whose life was brutally extinguished to appease a demanding deity. The fear of being chosen, or of watching a fellow human being sacrificed, would have infused such events with an unspeakable dread, a profound sense of cosmic terror. The presence of blood, the smell of burning flesh, and the visceral acts of slaughter were all integral parts of ancient celebrations. They were not seen as grim necessities, but as sacred acts, essential for maintaining the precarious balance between humanity and the powerful forces of the divine. This constant exposure to ritualized violence, however, undoubtedly desensitized people to bloodshed, and for the unfortunate sacrificial animals, it was a terrifying end to their lives amidst the celebratory clamor. The psychological impact of living in a world where blood and fear were so intertwined with celebration was profound. It meant that even moments of supposed joy and communal bonding were tinged with an awareness of violence and death. The gods were powerful and demanding, and their favor had to be constantly earned through painful, public acts. This fostered a pervasive sense of awe mixed with terror, a realization that human prosperity was often bought at a grim, bloody price. The misery wasn't just in the witnessing of these acts, but in the constant dread of what the gods might demand next, or what misfortunes might befall the community if the rituals were not performed correctly. This fear also dictated social behavior. People would meticulously follow ritual protocols, often at great personal or communal expense, out of profound religious conviction and terrifying fear of divine retribution. The spectacle of sacrifice served as a stark reminder of humanity's dependence on higher powers. Reinforcing social hierarchies and religious authority, the communal joy of celebration was thus intertwined with a shared experience of awe, fear, and the visceral reality of life and death. The academic debate about the ethical interpretation of ancient sacrifice often grapples with the tension between understanding cultural practices on their own terms and applying modern moral judgments. Some historians and anthropologists argue that animal sacrifice, while brutal to modern sensibilities, was a culturally rational and deeply meaningful act for ancient peoples, serving essential social functions like community bonding, expressing gratitude, and establishing a profound connection to the divine in a pre-scientific world. They contend that it provided psychological comfort and a sense of control over an unpredictable environment. The misery, in this view, was less about the act itself and more about our anachronistic judgment. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the inherent violence and exploitation in these practices, particularly the suffering of the animals and, in rarer instances, humans, arguing that these rituals demonstrate a darker side of ancient religiosity driven by fear and a primitive understanding of appeasement. They suggest that, even if culturally accepted, the sheer brutality and the underlying anxieties about capricious gods created a pervasive, terrifying atmosphere that was genuinely miserable for many. It's a debate that makes you ponder the complex, often disturbing, ways humanity has sought meaning and control in a world beyond their understanding, often with a profound cost, as the scent of ancient blood and the echoes of sacred fear from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations were often terrifyingly intertwined with ritual and sacrifice. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental elements that brought real misery, profound fear, and often brutal violence to ancient revelers. Their enjoyment, however brief, was always shadowed by the very real demands of the divine and the visceral reality of death. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting distance from such brutal public religious acts in your modern world. A reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities, as the chilling echoes of ancient blood sacrifices and the profound fears of divine appeasement from our last chapter recede. Allowing the gentle hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now move from the grand, public spectacles to a more personal, yet equally pervasive source of misery in ancient celebrations, exhaustion and overindulgence. Forget your carefully planned holiday schedules or your conscious efforts to eat healthy. In the ancient world, festivities often stretched for days, sometimes weeks, pushing participants to the limits of physical endurance and beyond, leading to dangerous excesses and their brutal aftermath. Imagine yourself participating in the ancient Olympic Games, not as a spectator in a comfortable stadium, but as an active participant or a dedicated observer. These games, originally religious festivals, lasted for 5 days, sometimes longer, packed with athletic contests, religious rituals, and constant revelry. You are subjected to the relentless glare of the sun, the dust kicked up by thousands of feet, the constant noise, and the pressure of endless social interaction. You might feel a little tired after a long weekend, but these people were facing days of relentless exertion. with little in the way of modern comforts or recovery. The sheer duration of ancient celebrations was often a primary source of misery. Unlike modern holidays that typically last a day or two, ancient festivals could extend for a week, sometimes even longer. Like the Roman Saturnalia, which lasted 7 days, or the Athenian Dionysia, which spanned 5 or 6. For the average citizen, this meant sustained physical activity, whether it was participating in processions, watching lengthy dramatic performances, attending numerous religious rites, or simply standing for hours in crowded public spaces. Imagine being on your feet for days on end, sleeping little, constantly exposed to the elements, and being expected to maintain a festive demeanor. Your feet would ache, your head would throb, and your patience would wear thin. Then there was the overindulgence in food and, more significantly, in drink. While we discussed the dangers of contaminated food and water in earlier chapters, the sheer quantity of consumption during celebrations was another serious problem. With social norms loosened and access to alcohol readily available, people would often drink to excess. Ancient wines, though weaker than modern spirits, were consumed in vast quantities. Imagine the immediate effects drunkenness leading to impaired judgment, arguments, accidents, and vulnerability to crime. Remember those discussions from Chapter 3. You might regret that extra slice of pie, but they were regretting a week of constant inebriation. The long-term effects were even worse. Sustained heavy drinking could lead to severe dehydration, liver strain, and acute alcohol poisoning, especially for those unaccustomed to such consumption. Combined with poor sleep and inadequate nutrition from irregular feasting, participants would quickly become physically and mentally depleted. The misery wasn't just the headache of a hangover, it was the profound physical and mental exhaustion. The feeling of your body breaking down under the strain of forced merriment, a common historical fact. The Roman Saturnalia, a winter festival celebrated around the winter solstice, was famous for its atmosphere of joyous abandon and role reversal, with masters serving slaves and public gambling being permitted. While seemingly a liberating holiday, its extended duration and emphasis on feasting and heavy drinking often led to widespread exhaustion and hangovers for many participants. The temporary suspension of social norms could also lead to chaotic behavior and an increased risk of personal injury or financial ruin from gambling. Imagine a week-long New Year's Eve party where everyone loses their inhibitions and then has to go back to work immediately after. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about overindulgence in ancient celebrations relates to food and drink-induced illness beyond simple food poisoning. Beyond the immediate dangers of spoiled food, the sheer richness and unusualness of celebratory meals, often consumed in large quantities by people whose regular diets were far simpler, could cause severe digestive distress. Think of excessive consumption of fatty meats, rich sauces, or unaccustomed spices, combined with heavy drinking. This could lead to intense indigestion, gallbladder attacks, or exacerbate underlying conditions that a person might not even know they had. Imagine someone whose daily diet consists mostly of gruel suddenly gorging on fatty pork and rich wine. Their body would simply not be prepared, leading to agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, and prolonged discomfort, turning the feast into a torment. It's like eating Thanksgiving dinner for a week straight, but without modern medicine to help. The demands placed on certain individuals during celebrations were even greater. Slaves, for instance, often had to work even harder during festivals, preparing food, serving guests, and cleaning up the colossal messes with little opportunity for rest or participation themselves. For them, a celebration was often just a period of intensified labor and increased exhaustion, a stark reminder of their subjugated status. You might complain about working a holiday, but at least you get paid overtime and a chance to relax afterwards. The psychological impact of forced revelry and extreme overindulgence was immense. It meant that moments of supposed joy could quickly turn into periods of intense physical and mental strain, leaving participants feeling drained, irritable, and often sick. The pressure to participate, to maintain a festive facade even when exhausted or ill, was a form of psychological torture. This could lead to a profound disillusionment with the very idea of celebration, transforming joyous anticipation into a sense of dread for the impending physical ordeal. This misery also reinforced social hierarchies. While the elite might have better access to comfortable resting places and more refined, though still potentially dangerous, food and drink, the vast majority of the population, particularly the poor and enslaved, bore the brunt of the physical demands and the consequences of overindulgence. Their exhaustion was often compounded by the necessity of returning to grueling labor immediately after the festivities concluded, with no recovery period. The academic debate about the actual health consequences of ancient overindulgence often grapples with the interpretation of ancient medical texts and the limited diagnostic capabilities of the time. Some historians argue that while ancient celebrations certainly involved excess, human physiology is remarkably adaptable, and that ancient peoples, being accustomed to tougher living conditions, might have been more resilient to the physical demands and dietary changes of festivals than we assume today. Suggesting that widespread severe illness from overindulgence was not necessarily the norm for everyone. They contend that people knew their limits, however loosely defined. The misery, in this view, was real but varied greatly by individual constitution. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the high baseline mortality rates, the prevalence of chronic illnesses, and the descriptions of common ailments like gout and stomach issues among the wealthy who could afford to overindulge more often, arguing that ancient celebrations, with their sustained periods of physical strain and excessive consumption, would have frequently led to acute health crises and exacerbated existing conditions for a significant portion of the population. They suggest that the concept of indulgence in ancient times carried a far greater physical risk than it does in the modern era. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense physical toll that daily life, let alone celebration, took on the human body in a world without modern medicine, as the physical aches of ancient revelry and the haze of ancient overindulgence slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations often brought profound exhaustion and sickness. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and physical suffering to ancient participants. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of pushing their bodies past their limits. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting ability to choose when and how much you celebrate, and the modern understanding of healthy limits, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities. As the lingering fatigue of ancient overindulgence and the physical toll of relentless celebrations from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to settle around you, we now shift our gaze from the revelers themselves to the often grim aftermath, waste and filth. Post-party perils. Forget your city's sanitation departments and carefully organized waste disposal. In the ancient world, the sheer volume of refuse generated by a large celebration quickly transformed vibrant public spaces into festering, disease-ridden landscapes, making the days after the party almost as miserable as the party itself. Imagine stepping out into the streets of ancient Rome the morning after a grand festival. Perhaps one of the Ludi public games or the Saturnalia we talked about earlier. The air, once filled with festive smells, is now thick with the stench of decay. You navigate through a chaotic landscape of trampled garlands, discarded food scraps, broken pottery, animal waste from sacrificial offerings and processional animals, and the unmistakable, overwhelming odor of human excrement. You might complain about a messy park after a summer concert, but that's usually just a few candy wrappers. Here, you're talking about an entire city drowning in its own waste. The fundamental problem was the primitive nature of ancient waste management. While some large cities like Rome had impressive sewage systems like the Cloaca Maxima, these were often designed primarily for rainwater drainage and flushing out public latrines, not for handling the enormous volume of solid waste generated by a city. let alone a festival population that could swell by thousands. For the most part, household waste, and definitely festival waste, was simply thrown into the streets, dumped into open pits, or left to decompose where it fell. During celebrations, this problem intensified exponentially. Imagine thousands of people eating, drinking, and performing bodily functions without adequate facilities. Food scraps, animal bones, leftover offerings, and human waste would accumulate rapidly on streets, in public squares, and around temples. The heat of the sun would accelerate decomposition, turning these organic materials into putrid, foul-smelling messes within hours. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a profound public health crisis waiting to happen. The flies would be buzzing in thick clouds, the rats would scurry brazenly, and the stench would be overwhelming. You might have to hold your nose walking past a dumpster, but imagine holding it for days and knowing the smell was everywhere. This accumulated filth was a direct contributor to the spread of disease. As we touched upon in Chapter 4, the waste provided perfect breeding grounds for disease vectors. Flies would land on excrement and then on food, transferring bacteria. Rats, attracted to the refuse, carried fleas that could transmit diseases like the bubonic plague. Contaminated water sources, already an issue, would become even more polluted as runoff from these unsanitary areas seeped into wells and rivers. The misery wasn't just the aesthetic horror, it was the chilling awareness that this very filth was a silent killer, claiming lives long after the last celebratory shout faded. A common historical fact. Despite their architectural prowess, ancient Roman cities famously struggled with street sanitation. While they had public baths and some impressive aqueducts, the disposal of everyday solid waste from homes and businesses often involved simply throwing it out the window into the street below. This practice, combined with animal droppings and festival refuse, meant that the streets were constantly covered in a layer of grime, attracting pests and contributing to widespread illness. Imagine walking down a street that was essentially a slow-moving, open sewer. It makes you appreciate your local sanitation workers a whole lot more, doesn't it? One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about post-celebration filth involves the fate of sacrificial animals' remains. After religious sacrifices, while some parts of the animal might be cooked and eaten, the non-edible organs, bones, and vast quantities of blood were often simply left in or around the temple precincts or public altars. Imagine literally rivers of blood flowing into gutters, or piles of guts left exposed to the elements. This attracted scavengers and created intense, localized sources of putrefaction and disease. For the priests and temple attendants, the days following a major festival would have been a grueling, nauseating cleanup operation, often risking their own health in the process. It's not just a little confetti cleanup, it's literally dealing with biological hazardous waste. The psychological impact of living amidst such pervasive waste and filth was profound. It meant that the celebration often concluded with a grim, sobering reality. The city became a cesspool, a stark reminder of humanity's inability to control its own biological footprint. This fostered a sense of resignation, a realization that dirt, disease, and unpleasant odors were simply an inescapable part of life, even after moments of supposed joy. The misery wasn't just the sensory assault, it was the constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability to its own effluence. This pervasive filth also created deep social divisions. While the wealthy might have larger homes with better though still rudimentary private latrines, and perhaps even servants to clear immediate surroundings, the vast majority of the population, particularly the poor, lived in close proximity to the accumulated waste. Their living conditions would deteriorate even further after a festival, compounding their already difficult lives and making them more susceptible to disease. The lingering stench of celebration was a stark symbol of societal inequality. The academic debate about the cleanliness of ancient cities and the effectiveness of their waste disposal systems often grapples with the archaeological evidence versus the textual accounts. Some historians argue that while ancient cities certainly weren't pristine by modern standards, they were not constant, unmitigated cesspools, and that some level of local community-based waste removal like individual dumping grounds or informal waste collectors existed, suggesting that the most extreme descriptions of filth might be sensationalized for literary effect. They contend that ancient populations developed ways to cope with their environment. The misery, in this view, was present, but perhaps not uniformly overwhelming. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the overwhelming archaeological evidence of thick layers of domestic and public refuse, the absence of widespread, organized municipal waste collection, and the consistent references to unpleasant smells and unsanitary conditions in ancient texts, arguing that post-celebration filth would have been a pervasive and significant source of discomfort, disease, and misery for most ancient urban dwellers. They suggest that modern romanticized views of ancient cities ignore the grim realities of their waste. It's a debate that makes you ponder how our present-day understanding of hygiene fundamentally colors our perception of the past, and how much we take for granted the invisible infrastructure that keeps our cities clean. As the putrid smells of ancient garbage and the teeming realities of post-party filth from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations often left behind a terrifying legacy of waste and disease. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and widespread sickness to ancient communities. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always followed by the very real threat of a contaminated environment. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible efficiency of modern waste disposal, the clean streets, and the understanding of sanitation. A reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful sight of ancient festivities, as the lingering stench of ancient waste and the chilling visions of post-party filth from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the quiet hum of your room to once again envelop you. We now turn to a more subtle, yet profoundly painful source of misery in ancient celebrations, social strife, and exclusion. Forget your inclusive modern gatherings. In the ancient world, many festivities, designed to unite, often served to highlight and exacerbate deep societal divisions, leaving many feeling marginalized, exploited, or utterly alone amidst the supposed merriment. Imagine yourself in a bustling public square in ancient Athens during a dramatic festival. You see citizens in their fine cloaks, discussing philosophy and politics. You see wealthy merchants enjoying prime seating. But then, your gaze drifts to the periphery. You notice the women, often relegated to separate sections or even barred from certain events. You see the slaves, silently serving, cleaning, and laboring, their faces devoid of the joy around them. You see the foreigners, present but never truly belonging, outsiders in a city not their own. You might feel a little awkward at a party where you don't know many people, but here, your very existence could mark you as fundamentally separate, even during moments of supposed unity. The most glaring example of social strife was the profound reality of slavery. In ancient Athens, a supposedly enlightened democracy, a significant portion of the population was enslaved. For these individuals, celebrations were rarely a time of joy or respite. Instead, they often meant increased labor preparing vast quantities of food, serving revelers, cleaning up enormous messes, remember Chapter 7, and attending to the needs of their masters. While some slaves might have been granted limited freedom or participated in certain less prestigious aspects of festivals, their presence was fundamentally one of servitude and forced participation. Imagine being forced to cater a party where everyone else is celebrating their freedom, a freedom you are explicitly denied. The irony would be a bitter pill. The misery for slaves during these times was immense. It was a constant reminder of their lack of agency, their dehumanization. They were surrounded by the very joy they could not truly partake in, their labor enabling the leisure of others. This created a stark contrast between the festive facade and the underlying reality of their brutal existence, making the celebrations a painful spectacle of their own oppression. Then there was the systemic exclusion of women from many public aspects of ancient celebrations. Particularly in societies like classical Athens, While women had their own domestic rituals and certain women, like priestesses, held important roles in specific religious cults, their participation in the grand public festivals, especially those involving politics, drama, or male social bonding, was often limited or entirely forbidden. They might watch from secluded balconies or be entirely absent. Imagine a major holiday where half the population is largely excluded from the main events, their voices unheard, their presence secondary. You might roll your eyes at a man cave party, but this was an entire culture structured that way. This exclusion reinforced their subordinate status in society. Their joy was often confined to the domestic sphere, while men enjoyed the public spectacle and social camaraderie. This created a sense of marginalization, a quiet resentment beneath the surface of the celebration. Their misery was less about physical pain and more about the constant psychological burden of being a second-class citizen, even during moments supposedly meant for collective happiness, a common historical fact. In ancient Greek symposia, which were elite male drinking parties that often accompanied or concluded celebrations, women, unless they were hetairai, educated courtesans, were almost entirely excluded. These symposia were intellectual and social gatherings where men would discuss philosophy, politics, and poetry, reinforcing male bonds and social hierarchies. The exclusion of respectable women from these central social functions during celebrations meant that a significant portion of polite society was deliberately sidelined from key celebratory activities. Imagine a New Year's Eve party where all the important conversations and connections happen in a separate room, and only men are allowed. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about social exclusion during ancient celebrations involves the treatment of foreigners or medics in cities like Athens. While some festivals had elements that welcomed visitors, foreign residents, even if they lived in the city for generations, typically lacked the full rights and privileges of citizens. They might be taxed more heavily, have limited legal protections, and often faced social prejudice. During celebrations, their status as outsiders would be particularly highlighted. They might participate as laborers or merchants, but the deep communal bonds and sense of shared heritage that defined many festivals would largely exclude them, leaving them to observe rather than fully belong. It's like being at a family reunion where everyone but you has a secret handshake. The poor also faced unique forms of exclusion and misery. While some celebrations involved public distributions of food or money, these were often insufficient to truly alleviate their daily struggles. For many, attending a festival meant sacrificing precious work time or incurring expenses they could ill afford. They might gaze upon the lavish feasts and elaborate costumes of the wealthy, highlighting the vast disparities in wealth and status, rather than creating a sense of unity. Imagine being at a grand party, hungry and tired, watching others feast on abundance you can only dream of. The celebration could be a stark, painful reminder of their own poverty. The psychological impact of such pervasive social strife and exclusion was immense. It meant that moments of supposed collective joy were, for many, moments of heightened awareness of their own marginalization, their lack of freedom, or their subordinate status. This fostered resentment, envy, and a profound sense of injustice, eroding any genuine sense of shared happiness. The misery wasn't just in the physical conditions, but in the constant psychological burden of being an outsider looking in, or being forced to serve those who celebrated your oppression. This exclusion also had broader societal implications. It reinforced and legitimized existing hierarchies, ensuring that power remained concentrated in the hands of a select few. The celebrations thus served as performative acts of social control, showcasing who belonged and who did not, who had power and who was powerless. This grim reality underlay many of the outwardly joyous spectacles of the ancient world. The academic debate about the precise level of social integration or exclusion during ancient celebrations often grapples with the ideal presented by ancient philosophical texts versus the harsh realities depicted in legal and historical records. Some historians argue that while hierarchies certainly existed, Ancient celebrations also offered limited opportunities for social mixing and temporary suspensions of normal rules like during Saturnalia, suggesting that they provided a vital, if brief, outlet for social tensions and a sense of communal belonging, even for the marginalized. They contend that the misery of exclusion was not absolute or universally felt. The misery in this view was present but balanced by moments of genuine interaction. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the inherent structural inequalities of ancient societies. Slavery, patriarchy, rigid class systems, arguing that celebrations, far from blurring these lines, often served to reinforce them through highly ritualized roles and access restrictions, making the experience for the excluded fundamentally one of alienation and heightened awareness of their subordinate status. They suggest that modern concepts of inclusion are anachronistic when applied to ancient contexts, and that the suffering of the excluded was often immense. It's a debate that makes you ponder how even moments of supposed joy can be deeply painful for those on the fringes, and how the fabric of society can be woven with threads of both connection and profound division. As the quiet sighs of the marginalized and the unsettling echoes of social exclusion from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations often brought profound social strife and misery. These weren't just minor inconveniences, they were fundamental challenges that highlighted and deepened the inequalities of ancient societies. Their enjoyment, however fleeting for some, was always overshadowed by the very real pain of those who were denied full participation. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, if imperfect, ideals of modern inclusivity and the struggle for equality that continues. A reassurance that was a distant, painful dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities. As the quiet pangs of social exclusion and the unsettling echoes of ancient societal divisions from our last chapter mercifully dissipate, allowing the gentle hum of your room to reassert its calming presence, we now confront a different, often silent, but pervasive source of misery that plagued ancient celebrations: vulnerability and danger open targets. Forget your secure venues and robust emergency services. In the ancient world, large gatherings, far from offering safety in numbers, often made individuals and entire communities terrifyingly susceptible to a myriad of threats, both human and natural. Imagine yourself as a traveler arriving in a bustling ancient city for a major festival, perhaps during the Roman Republic, or even a smaller frontier American town preparing for a large harvest fair in the 18th century. You're excited, perhaps a little overwhelmed by the crowds and noise, but as you navigate the throng, a gnawing unease begins to set in. You realize you are a soft target, your valuables potentially exposed, your personal safety tenuous, and the very ground beneath your feet perhaps less stable than it seems. You might worry about losing your phone in a busy crowd, but here, you could lose everything, including your life, without much hope of recourse. One of the most immediate dangers was the vulnerability to crime. As we touched upon briefly in Chapter 3, large crowds were a haven for pickpockets, thieves, and even more violent criminals. The anonymity of the throng, combined with the general festive distraction and often widespread intoxication, created perfect conditions for exploitation. Imagine having your purse snatched, or your meager belongings stolen, leaving you destitute and stranded far from home. Without organized police forces or quick methods of communication, your chances of recovering lost items or apprehending criminals were incredibly slim. The celebration itself, with its focus on revelry, made people less vigilant, turning them into easy prey. Beyond petty theft, there was the constant threat of physical assault. Arguments, fueled by alcohol and heightened emotions, could quickly escalate into brawls, and the sheer density of people made it difficult to escape. For women, in particular, large, unsupervised crowds presented heightened risks of harassment or more serious forms of violence. Imagine being jostled and groped in a tight crowd, or witnessing a brutal fight erupt nearby. with nowhere safe to retreat. The joy of the celebration could instantly transform into a terrifying struggle for personal safety, a common historical fact in ancient Rome. Large public celebrations and gladiatorial games often drew vast crowds into confined spaces like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus. These venues, while impressive for their time, lacked modern safety regulations. Exits could become bottlenecked, and in the event of panic, fire, or collapse, mass casualties from stampedes or structural failure were a very real risk. The historical record includes accounts of such disasters, sometimes claiming hundreds or thousands of lives, demonstrating that even carefully organized ancient events could become death traps due to the sheer volume of attendees. Imagine being trapped in a burning building, but it's a stadium filled with 50,000 people and only a few narrow exits. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about vulnerability during ancient celebrations relates to accidents and infrastructure failure. Beyond intentional violence, ancient structures and public spaces, not built to modern engineering standards or for sustaining immense, prolonged crowd pressures, were prone to collapse or other dangerous failures. Imagine being packed into a wooden bleacher watching a performance, feeling it creak ominously under the collective weight, or a makeshift stage giving way during a dance. Or consider the danger of open flames used for cooking and lighting in densely packed areas, leading to devastating fires that could sweep through temporary structures or even entire neighborhoods. These weren't just theoretical dangers, they were very real and often fatal occurrences that turned joyous gatherings into scenes of utter devastation, highlighting how precarious ancient infrastructure truly was. It's not just a little rickety, it's a literal death trap waiting to happen. Furthermore, the very nature of ancient society, with its limited communication and transportation, meant that if a disaster did strike during a large celebration, response times were incredibly slow. There were no emergency services, no paramedics, no organized rescue teams. The injured would often lie unattended for hours, if not days, and help, if it arrived at all, would be from untrained bystanders or overwhelmed families. Imagine breaking a leg in a crowded festival. You might simply be left to the mercy of those around you, without any hope of swift medical attention. The geographical vulnerability also played a role. Many ancient cities and celebratory sites were located near rivers prone to flooding, coastlines vulnerable to tsunamis or storms, or in areas susceptible to earthquakes. While not directly caused by the celebration, the concentration of people in these vulnerable locations during a major event dramatically increased the potential for mass casualties if a natural disaster struck. Imagine thousands of people gathered in a coastal town for a festival, only for a sudden, devastating tsunami to wipe out the entire celebration. The psychological impact of such pervasive vulnerability and danger was immense. It meant that even moments of supposed collective joy were tinged with a constant, low-level dread. Every shadow, every jostle, every creaking sound could signal impending disaster. This fostered a profound sense of helplessness, a realization that safety was never guaranteed, and that even in numbers, individuals were still terrifyingly exposed. The misery wasn't just in the physical harm suffered, but in the constant anxiety of anticipating it, transforming moments of supposed relaxation into periods of high alert. This fear also dictated social behavior. People might avoid certain areas, try to stay close to trusted companions, or simply steel themselves for the inevitable risks. For those who were already marginalized or physically weaker, the dangers were even greater, as they were often unable to defend themselves or escape quickly if disaster struck. The celebration, rather than offering a break from daily hardships, often intensified them, layering new anxieties on top of existing ones. The academic debate about the actual frequency and impact of such dangers often grapples with the historical emphasis on major catastrophes versus the undocumented daily realities. Some historians argue that while spectacular disasters certainly occurred, ancient communities developed a pragmatic, if informal, system of self-policing and mutual aid during celebrations, suggesting that most attendees navigated these events without experiencing severe harm. and that minor incidents were simply part of the accepted risk of public life. They contend that human resilience allowed people to manage these dangers. The misery, in this view, was real but not necessarily constant for everyone. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the archaeological and textual evidence of common injuries, the lack of effective safety measures, and the documented instances of stampedes, fires, and opportunistic crime, arguing that ancient celebrations were inherently high-risk environments where personal safety was constantly compromised for a significant portion of attendees, making the vulnerability a pervasive and significant source of misery. They suggest that modern standards of safety and security are so far removed from ancient reality that we struggle to fully appreciate the constant peril. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense courage and fatalism required to participate in ancient public life, knowing that any joyous occasion could swiftly turn into a scene of personal tragedy or mass disaster, as the shadowy dangers of ancient crowds and the chilling echoes of infrastructure failure from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why ancient celebrations often brought profound vulnerability and danger. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real misery and widespread peril to ancient participants. Their enjoyment, however fleeting, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of harm, far beyond a lost wallet. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, pervasive safety nets of modern society, the emergency services, the building codes, and the general expectation of public order, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient festivities. As the chilling whispers of ancient vulnerability and the haunting specter of public peril from our last chapter finally dissipate, leaving you wrapped in the serene calm of your own peaceful space, our deep dive into the often terrible realities of ancient celebrations now draws to a close. This final chapter isn't about one more historical horror. Instead, it's about the modern echoes and lessons learned, how these ancient struggles, though seemingly far removed from our meticulously planned events and highly regulated societies, continue to resonate, often subtly, within our contemporary lives, offering profound insights into the enduring human experience. Imagine, if you will, looking around your own room right now. You're likely surrounded by the comforts of modern life climate control, readily available clean water, and the expectation of safety and order. Yet, despite all our advancements, a deep, ancient part of our human experience still grapples with anxieties that are strikingly similar to those that made ancient celebrations so dreadful. You might scroll through social media on your phone, perhaps seeing images of crowded festivals or large public gatherings. Do you ever feel a flicker of unease, a slight anxiety about the sheer number of people, the potential for a mishap, or the lingering thought of what could go wrong? That's the echo. One of the most immediate echoes is our continued, often unconscious, struggle with crowds and hygiene. While we don't attribute disease to miasma anymore, the fear of invisible pathogens in crowded spaces is far from gone. Think about a major sporting event, a massive concert, or even just rush hour on a subway. You might instinctively pull your collar up, or reach for hand sanitizer, or feel a subtle prickle of anxiety when someone coughs too close to you. This modern vigilance, born from our scientific understanding of germs, is a direct descendant of the ancient dread of contagion that turned celebratory throngs into breeding grounds for plague. Remember how quickly anxieties around a global pandemic can turn even a trip to the grocery store into a source of dread. That's the ancient fear of unseen enemies, repackaged. Then there's the persistent challenge of public order and safety. While police forces are ubiquitous now, massive modern celebrations still require immense security planning. Think of the intense security presence at Times Square on New Year's Eve, or the detailed crowd control measures at large music festivals. Despite all the planning, incidents of violence, stampedes, or even just petty crime still occur. This constant need for external control to maintain peace in large gatherings is a direct inheritance from the ancient struggle against mob violence and the chaos that could erupt when people gathered in numbers. We've just swapped a few overworked guards with shields for thousands of trained officers and surveillance cameras. The echoes of overindulgence and its consequences are also clear. While we may not feast on garum-soaked fish guts for days, modern celebrations often involve excessive consumption of rich foods and alcohol. Think of the post-holiday detoxes, the New Year's resolutions to cut back, or the very real health consequences of chronic overeating and drinking. The hangovers, the indigestion, and the sheer physical exhaustion from pushing our bodies too hard during celebrations are remarkably similar to what ancient revelers experienced. Albeit with better access to ibuprofen and rehydration salts now. It's a testament to the enduring human tendency to celebrate with excess, and the body's enduring refusal to cooperate without consequence. Even the ancient concept of social exclusion subtly reverberates. While overt slavery and complete gender segregation are thankfully not norms in most modern societies, celebrations can still highlight existing inequalities. Think of the homeless person begging outside a lavish gala, or the person who can't afford tickets to a major event. Even seemingly inclusive celebrations can unintentionally create outsiders who feel alienated, or whose labor-like service staff enables the enjoyment of others. The discomfort some feel when confronted with glaring wealth disparities during festive seasons is a modern echo of the profound misery experienced by the poor, the enslaved, and the marginalized in ancient celebrations. The party still isn't for everyone. The academic debate concerning the human brain's hardwired responses to social dynamics and environmental threats often looks to these historical experiences. Some social psychologists and historians argue that the awful aspects of ancient celebrations provide a timeless case study in human behavioral patterns, under stress and in large groups, suggesting that our modern anxieties about crowds, security, and even personal health are rooted in deeply evolved survival mechanisms that haven't fundamentally changed. Regardless of technological advancement, they contend that these ancient scenarios illustrate universal human vulnerabilities. The misery, in this view, is a perpetual human condition, merely expressed differently across eras. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the unique cultural and technological solutions that modern societies have developed to mitigate these ancient problems, arguing that while underlying human nature might persist, the experience of celebration has been radically transformed by improved hygiene, organized public safety, and advanced medical care, making the misery of ancient times largely incomparable to anything we experience today. They suggest that while echoes exist, the sheer scale of ancient suffering is almost alien to us. It's a debate that makes you ponder how much of human experience is universal, and how much is shaped by the specific circumstances of our time. So, as our deep dive into the truly awful side of ancient celebrations concludes, you are left with a profound understanding. These weren't just quaint historical footnotes. They were fundamental aspects of daily life, shaping the joys and fears of ancient peoples in profound ways. They were born from genuine human misery, the pain of sickness, the terror of chaos, the burden of exhaustion, and the sting of exclusion. These celebrations, despite their outward grandeur, offered a chilling mirror to the harsh realities of ancient existence. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, surrounded by the quiet hum of your modern world, recognize the faint echoes of these ancient struggles. They whisper in our anxieties about crowded spaces, in our efforts to maintain public order, in our hangovers from too much indulgence, and in our ongoing efforts to create more inclusive societies. But tonight, there are no open sewers just outside your window, no rampaging mobs down the street, and no immediate threat of plague from your shared cup. The harsh realities of the past are now illuminated by scientific understanding and confined to the fascinating realm of history. So, let the echoes of these ancient miseries fade now. Let the discomfort of historical grime and the anxieties of past perils dissolve into the quiet hum of your night. As you drift deeper into slumber, Imagine the cool, clean air flowing freely, the nourishing food readily available, the soft security of your home. Feel the rhythmic rise and fall of your breath, a calming tide pulling you gently into the depths of rest. The terrifying aspects of ancient revelry recede, replaced by the soft embrace of your blankets. All tension, all worry, all the echoes of past suffering are now distant, quieted by the peace of your present moment. Your body grows heavy, your mind serene. Just rest now, and let the quietness of your peaceful space guide you into a deep, restorative sleep.